There is a sound that carries across centuries, children's voices, high and clear, singing words they don't understand, their hands joined, their feet moving in a circle that turns and turns like something much older than memory. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. You know this rhyme. Most of us do. It lives in playgrounds and parks, in schoolyards and backyards, passed from one generation of children to the next without ceremony or explanation. It requires no instruments, no props, no adults, just voices and movement and the willingness to fall. The game is simple. Children hold hands and walk in a circle, singing together. When they reach the final line, they collapse to the ground, laughing. Then they rise and begin again. Over and over, the same circle, the same song, the same joyful collapse. It feels innocent, timeless in the way only children's games can feel. But beneath that innocence, something else has taken root. For decades now, a story has been told about this rhyme, a story darker than any children's game should carry. You may have heard it yourself. The claim is specific and unsettling, that Ring Around the Rosie is not innocent at all, but a memory of the Black Death. That the rosy refers to the red rash that marked plague victims, that the posies were herbs people carried to ward off infection or mask the smell of death. That ashes recalls the burning of bodies or the phrase ashes to ashes spoken over mass graves. And that final line, we all fall down, is not play at all, but a children's reenactment of mass mortality. According to this interpretation, the rhyme is a kind of cultural scar, a way that survivors preserved the horror of 1665, or perhaps even the Great Plague of 1348, encoding pandemic into a song that children would sing for centuries without knowing what they were remembering. It's a compelling story, dark enough to feel true, specific enough to sound historical, and it has been repeated so many times in classrooms, in books, on the internet that for many people, it has become inseparable from the rhyme itself. But here is where the fracture appears. The earliest known written version of Ring Around the Rosie does not appear until the 1880 seconds, not in the 17th century. Not even close to any major plague outbreak. It shows up in children's game collections in Britain and America, recorded as something already being sung, already familiar, but with no mention of disease, death, or historical trauma. And the words themselves, those specific words that seem to match the plague interpretation so perfectly they vary. In some versions, it's not ashes at all, but a tissue, meant to sound like sneezing. In others, the flowers change. The structure shifts, the falling remains, but the rest is unstable, as if the rhyme itself is not a fixed memory but something still changing, still being reshaped by the voices that carry it. Folklorists, the people who study these songs professionally, have largely dismissed the plague theory. They point out that retrospective interpretation, the act of looking backward and finding meaning that was never intended, is one of the most common mistakes we make with old rhymes. We see patterns because we want them to be there. We find tragedy because tragedy feels more real than play, and yet the story persists. Perhaps because it offers something we need, a way to believe that even the worst moments of history leave a trace, that suffering is not erased but encoded, that children, without knowing it, carry the grief of the dead in their games, or perhaps because the rhyme itself, so simple, so repetitive, so strangely insistent, feels like it must mean something more than it says. The question, then, is not whether Ring Around the Rosie is about the plague. The question is why a children's game about falling down feels like it should be. If you go looking for Ring Around the Rosie in history, you will not find a single origin. You will find echoes. Across Europe, across centuries, there are games that look like cousins to the rhyme we know. Not identical, but close enough that the resemblance is undeniable. Children holding hands in circles, songs about flowers, about falling, about movements that repeat until someone collapses. The words change, the melodies shift, but the structure underneath remains. In medieval France, there were ring dances called rondes, circle games sung during festivals and holy days, often in churchyards or village squares. Some involved flowers, some involved falling. Many have been lost, their words unrecorded, but the practice itself, children and adults moving together in ritual circles, was widespread and ancient. In Germany, a game called Ringel Ringel Rosen appears in written records by the 19th century, though it was clearly being played long before anyone thought to write it down. The name itself echoes the English version. Ringel means ring, Rosen means roses. The children sing, they circle, they fall. The details differ, but the pattern holds. In Scandinavian villages, similar games appear with different flowers, different words, but the same essential movement: a circle, a chant, a ritualized collapse. Sometimes the falling represents sleep, sometimes death, sometimes nothing is explained at all. The game simply is, passed along without interpretation, without question. Even in early American settlements, versions of the rhyme show up in regional variations. Some use ashes, some use sneezing sounds, some replace flowers with other symbols entirely. But the circle remains, the falling remains. What this suggests is not a single story being remembered, but a form being repeated, a template. Ring games are among the oldest forms of communal play. Before written language, before fixed borders, before the idea of childhood as a separate category of life, people gathered in circles. They sang together. They moved together. The circle itself was symbolic, no beginning, no end, a shape that represented wholeness, continuity, the cycles of seasons and life. Flowers, too, appear again and again in these old games, not because of any single event, but because flowers carried meaning. They marked time. They symbolized beauty and decay. They were used in rituals of protection, celebration, and mourning. In a world without clocks or calendars as we know them, flowers told people where they were in the year, what was ending, what was beginning. And the falling, the collapse that ends the game and starts it again, this too is older than any plague. Folklorists who study these patterns point out that ritualized falling appears in children's games across cultures that had no contact with one another. In some traditions, falling represents the end of harvest. In others, it mimics death and resurrection, a symbolic enactment of renewal. In still others, it is simply the physical release that makes the game fun, the moment of chaos that lets children break the circle and start again. The version of Around the Rosie that we know today may have crystallized in the 19th century, but the game it came from is far older. It did not need a plague to exist. It existed because circle games have always existed, because children have always played with the ideas of falling and rising, of holding on and letting go, because communities have always used song and movement to bind themselves together, to mark time, to turn the fearful and the sacred into something they could hold in their hands. What we are looking at, then, is not a memory of one disaster. We are looking at a form that predates nations, predates literacy, predates the idea that games need explanations. This does not make Around the Rosie less mysterious. If anything, it makes the mystery deeper. Because if the game is not about one thing, if it is not encoding one moment in history, then what is it preserving? Why does this particular pattern, this circle, this chant, this fall feel so insistent? Why has it survived when so many other games have disappeared? The answer may be that it survived precisely because it was never about one thing. It was about something larger, something that every generation could pour their own fears and hopes into. A structure flexible enough to hold new words, new meanings, new anxieties, while keeping its original shape intact. The oldest echoes do not give us a single story, they give us a pattern. And patterns, unlike stories, do not need to be understood to be passed along, they only need to be repeated. To understand what these games once meant, you have to step outside the world we live in now. You have to imagine a time when survival was not guaranteed, when winter could kill, when harvest determined whether a village lived or starved, when disease, famine, and death were not distant possibilities but present realities, woven into the fabric of everyday life. In that world, ritual was not decoration. It was necessary. People gathered in circles not for entertainment, but to bind themselves together, to mark the passing of seasons, to invoke protection, to honor the dead, to enact the cycles that governed everything, planting and harvest, birth and death, the endless turning of time. Ring dances were sacred before they were games. They appear in records of medieval festivals tied to the agricultural calendar. At May Day, villages would gather to dance in circles around maypoles, celebrating the return of spring, the rebirth of the land. At harvest time, similar dances marked the end of the growing season, a moment of gratitude and exhaustion. At winter solstice, circles were danced to symbolize the sun's return, the promise that light would come back even in the darkest months. These were not performances, they were communal acts. Everyone participated, adults and children, young and old, because the circle required everyone. It represented wholeness, continuity, the idea that the community itself was a living thing that needed tending. And within these circles, symbols carried weight. Flowers were not just decorative. In a world without modern medicine, flowers and herbs were believed to offer protection. Posies, small bunches of aromatic plants, were carried during times of illness, not because they cured disease, but because scent was thought to ward off bad air, the miasma believed to carry sickness. Flowers also marked the passage of time. Their blooming and wilting told people where they stood in the cycle of the year. They were reminders of life's brevity, its beauty, its inevitable decay. Ashes, too, carried meaning. In medieval and early modern Europe, ashes were tied to rituals of mourning and purification. Ash Wednesday marked the beginning of Lent, a time of fasting and reflection, when ashes were placed on foreheads as a reminder. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Ashes appeared in funeral rites, in cleansing ceremonies, in moments when communities needed to acknowledge loss and prepare for renewal. To fall, to collapse to the ground was to enact death itself. Not literal death, but symbolic death. The kind that children could play with, could repeat, could survive. Folklorists suggest that many old ring games served as rehearsals for the cycles that governed life. Falling and rising mirrored the rhythm of seasons, the death of winter, the rebirth of spring. It mirrored the planting of seeds, buried in darkness, waiting to emerge. It mirrored human mortality, the understanding that everyone falls eventually, but the circle continues. In this context, the game was not morbid. It was coherent. It gave children a way to hold something too large and frightening to fully understand. It let them practice the idea of impermanence in a space that was safe, controlled, repeated. They fell, but they got back up. The circle broke, but it reformed. The song ended, but it began again. This was not about remembering one catastrophe. It was about living with fragility as a constant condition. Pre-modern people did not have the luxury of ignoring death. It was too close, too frequent, too woven into the structure of life. And so they ritualized it. They turned it into song, into movement, into games that children could inherit and carry forward. Not to preserve trauma, but to make survival possible. To give form to fear so it could be managed, repeated, endured. The game, in this sense, was a kind of protection. Not against death, nothing could protect against that, but against the unbearable weight of knowing death was always near. By turning mortality into a game, by making it something that could be sung and danced and laughed at, communities gave themselves a way to go on living. They gave their children a way to grow up in a world where loss was inevitable without being consumed by it. This is what the circle games may have done for the people who first danced them. They held what could not be spoken. They gave shape to what was too vast to understand. And they survived, not because they recorded history, but because they met a need that never went away. The need to make sense of impermanence, to ritualize what we cannot control, to turn the unbearable into something we can hold in our hands and pass along. The meaning was never hidden. It was woven into the structure itself. And children, without knowing any of this, still sing it, still hold hands, still fall down laughing, carrying forward a ritual whose purpose they will never need to explain, because the act of doing it is enough. So what are we left with? A children's game that feels older than it is, a rhyme with no fixed origin, a pattern that repeats across centuries and borders, carrying meanings we can no longer fully name, and a modern story persistent, compelling, almost certainly untrue, that tries to give it all a single explanation. The plague theory fails as history. The dates don't match. The evidence doesn't hold. Folklorists have traced the rhyme backward and found no connection to the Black Death, no hidden memorial encoded in children's play. What they found instead was something more complex, a form that existed long before the words we know, a ritual structure so old that trying to pin it to one event is like trying to catch water in your hands. But perhaps that's not what matters most. Perhaps what matters is why we keep trying, why we need Ring Around the Rosie to mean something more than play. Why a story about plague and mass graves feels more true to us than the possibility that the game is simply what it appears to be, a circle, a song, a fall, repeated because repetition is what children do, what communities have always done, what memory itself requires to survive. The truth is that the game did not survive because it recorded one moment. It survived because it held something larger, the tension between joy and mortality, between innocence and the knowledge that innocence cannot last, between the impulse to hold hands and form circles, and the understanding that every circle eventually breaks. These are not historical truths, they are human truths. Truths that do not belong to one century or one plague, but to every generation that has ever had to reckon with impermanence. And so the game persists. We still teach it to children. We still watch them join hands and sing words they don't understand. We still see them collapse, laughing, and rise to begin again. And something in us recognizes this as important, even if we can no longer say why. Maybe that recognition is the oldest echo of all. Not a memory of what happened, but a memory of what it felt like to need rituals that could hold the unbearable, to need songs that let you practice falling and getting back up, to need games that turned fragility into something children could carry forward without being crushed by it. The original meaning is gone, or perhaps it was never singular to begin with. Perhaps the game was always a vessel, designed to hold whatever each generation poured into it. Fear of plague, fear of famine, fear of loss, fear of the cycles that govern life and death and everything in between. What we preserve when we teach Ring Around the Rosie is not a fact. It is a form, a way of moving together, a way of singing something too large to say, a way of falling down and rising, over and over, until the repetition itself becomes a kind of knowledge. Children do not need to understand this to feel it. They hold hands, they form the circle, they sing the words that were sung before them, and in doing so, they join something that stretches back further than any written record, further than any single story, into a time when circles and songs and ritualized movement were how people made sense of a world that offered no guarantees. The game is not about the plague, but it is about what the plague represents, what every disaster represents, the fear that we will fall and not rise, that the circle will break and not reform, that what we love will be taken from us without warning, without meaning, without mercy. And the game says, yes, we fall, but we get back up, we do it together, we do it again. This is not an answer. It is not comfort in any conventional sense, but it is something, a structure, a rhythm, a way of holding what cannot be held and passing it along anyway. Perhaps the truth of Ring Around the Rosie is not in what it remembers. Perhaps it is in what it reveals about memory itself, that we preserve what we cannot bear to forget, even when we no longer understand what we are preserving, that we encode meaning into forms so simple a child can carry them, so durable they outlast empires, languages, the very people who first sang them, that we need rituals that let us practice the unbearable until it becomes bearable, that we need games that let us fall down laughing, because falling down laughing is the only way some truths can be told. The children are still singing, the circle is still turning, and somewhere beneath the words, beneath the centuries, beneath every interpretation we have tried to impose, the game continues doing what it has always done, holding us, letting us fall, bringing us back.